Hello everyone, in today's video I finish up all the suspension upgrades on the 3D printed Rallycross chassis that I'm using for the Subaru Impreza build. Last week I was able to make a lot of progress on the 3D printed chassis I'm using for the Subasharu Rallycross project. I printed out a ton of new parts and began assembling them. In today's video I'm going to be finishing the chassis. I started by cutting the 4mm steel rods that I'm using on the rear knuckles. After being cut to the correct length, I glue them in place. With the rear knuckles ready, I can now assemble the rear suspension. I started with the upper control arms. I used a hobby knife to remove any imperfections, and then I secured the knuckle to it and made sure that the knuckle can move smoothly. As you may remember in the last video, the lower shock mount on the lower control arm was too large for the fasteners that these shocks use. I modified the design of the lower control arms, moving the lower shock mount slightly outward as well as reducing the diameter of the hole. After making these changes, I printed out the new control arms. With the new parts printed, I glued them together, verified that the holes are now the correct size, and then replaced the lower control arms I had already installed on the front suspension with these new ones. I also went ahead and mounted the shocks to the lower control arms. With everything on the front suspension looking good, I moved on to finishing assembling the rear suspension. After installing the half shaft, I noticed that it was a bit too long, so I assembled and installed some new shafts that are slightly shorter. With the new shaft installed, everything fit well and moved smoothly, but I decided I wanted to install some slightly longer upper control arms since the ones currently installed gave the rear a little too much negative camber. The angle of the rear knuckle looks much better after installing this new upper control arm. After once again ensuring that everything was moving smoothly, I then installed the suspension components on the opposite side. At this point, all of the new suspension components were installed and everything was functioning as it should. The only thing left to do as far as completing the suspension is to make the upper shock mounts. To design the upper shock mounts, I started by modeling a very simple body to represent the shock. Once complete, I positioned it how I wanted it to mount to the suspension. Once in the correct location, I began designing the upper shock mount. I wanted to make it as rigid and durable as possible, so I made sure to make the part relatively thick and have a sufficient amount of support. After completing the design, I sliced the model using Simplify 3D and printed out the parts using a solid infill for extra strength. The mounts turned out great and feel very strong, so I went ahead and mounted them to the upper differential housing and mounted the shocks. With everything looking good and moving smoothly on the front suspension, I did the same for the rear. Now that both the front and rear suspension assemblies are fully assembled, I was ready to mount them to the chassis. I first wanted to start by installing all the new steering components. I began by removing the old steering arms. Once removed, I secured the new steering arms to the tie rods and secured the tie rods to the steering knuckles. After making sure these components were moving smoothly, I attached the steering arms to the rack and then mounted the arms to the chassis. Finally, I secured the front suspension assembly to the chassis, reusing the 4 screws from before. With the front suspension solidly mounted, I repeated the same process to mount the rear suspension assembly. After that, all that was left to do was install the wheels. I wanted to take this car for a quick test drive to see how it performs. However, it sounds like the pinion gear is slipping, so I'll need to get that tightened before I'm able to drive it. As I mentioned in the previous video, these new suspension components feel much better than the old ones, and are definitely much stronger, especially the upper shock mount. The only thing I might still want to do is place some bushings between the control arm mounts and the control arms to allow them to move a bit more smoothly. As I mentioned in the previous video, because of how the control arms are printed, it's a bit hard to get the section that mounts to the car to be smooth, so having something like a bushing in between should allow for much smoother movement while still allowing there to be a tight tolerance, which eliminates play. I'm getting closer to being ready to start releasing the files for this chassis, as well as doing some more builds utilizing these components, which should definitely make for some cool projects. This past week I've also been able to make some progress on several other projects as well, including the Firebird Drift build that I'm in the process of doing a complete suspension overhaul on, as well as testing some 124 scale drivetrain and suspension components that soon will be added to the Make It RC store. I've been slowly adding some new items to the store, and again I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who has purchased items from there. The support is greatly appreciated. As always, I want to conclude this video by showcasing some of the awesome vehicles that you all have been posting over on the Make It RC Facebook group. I'd also like to shout out a couple of YouTube channels, the first being one that I'm sure many of you are aware of, but for those who aren't, I highly recommend checking out K-Pop RC. The quality of his videos and builds is insane, and I highly recommend checking out his channel. I also recommend checking out the White Will RC Drift. I recently stumbled upon this channel while browsing videos, and I really like the custom builds and use of 3D printed parts. Links to both these channels are below in the description. And that is all for this video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.